Another issue with the Kinsey Report is that it is not presented as a morally neutral document. Both volumes contain many sweeping assertions and often move quickly from tables full of data to moral speculation about the repressed sexual ethics of America. Sexual behavior in the human male in particular blurs the distinction between objective statistical data gathered by the Kinsey researchers and what Kinsey called supplementary data. Supplementary data referred to opinions and observations offered by participants on various aspects of sex, and is often used as the basis for Kinsey's conclusions around sexual ethics. It is difficult to accept Kinsey's conclusions as facts when it cannot be determined if they are based on statistical findings or the views and opinions offered by his test subjects. Some criticize Kinsey for using his research to intentionally destigmatize sex and sexual orientation, but biographer James T. Jones explains that Kinsey, tired of being weighed down by Victorian morality, was, quote, determined to use science to strip human sexuality of its guilt and repression, unquote. One section of the Kinsey Report that remains controversial to this day is Chapter 5, Early Sexual Growth and Activity. After reviewing the data reported in this chapter, it becomes clear that Kinsey's source for much of this information was a child molester. Kinsey's reasoning for using this source is, quote, better data on pre-adolescent climax come from the histories of adult males who have had sexual contacts with younger boys and who, with their adult backgrounds, are able to recognize and interpret the boys' experiences, unquote. These so-called sources provided information on 317 adolescent boys, ranging in age from 2 months to 15 years old. Former Kinsey Institute director John Bancroft has asserted that all of Kinsey's data concerning children and adolescents came from one man, not a series of individuals as the book indicates. If Bancroft is right, then Kinsey is guilty of lying in his research, as well as protecting the identity of a serial child molester. The most horrifying passage in the male report is the description of children who are clearly being sexually assaulted. Sorry guys, I'm a mom and it's a little bit hard for me to read this sometimes. Okay. The children were described as follows, quote, groaning, sobbing, or more violent cries, sometimes with an abundance of tears, especially among younger children. Some children also fight away from their partner, unquote. There is no way to classify this other than a terrified child being raped and traumatized. Kinsey attempts to lessen the horror of what he's describing by using very clinical language. The child molesters are called sexual partners or adult observers. Even if Kinsey saw the scientific value of including this information in his study, the question still remains, why didn't he turn this person or persons over to the police? The Kinsey Institute denies the accusation that Kinsey sought out or encouraged pedophiles as a part of his research, but acknowledges that men who had had sexual experiences with children were interviewed as part of the study. Most sources covering this topic indicate that Alfred Kinsey ultimately made a judgment call based on his obligation to protect the anonymity of his subjects versus the likelihood of their crimes continuing. This seems like a pretty thin argument considering that someone with a history of assaulting children is statistically likely to keep doing it. In recent years, critics have pointed out the parallels between Joe Paterno and Alfred Kinsey. Paterno was fired from Penn State because he did not report a child molester to the police, which is exactly what Kinsey failed to do. This raises an additional question. Why was Kinsey not disciplined in some way for his actions? If you have been the victim of rape or sexual assault and you need someone to talk to, you can contact the National Sexual Assault Hotline. The phone number is 800-656-HOPE. That's 800-656-4673. All in all, these criticisms did not discourage Kinsey, but they did scare away many of the Institute's donors. The officers and trustees of the Rockefeller Foundation took steps to withdraw their support from Kinsey's Institute for Sex Research. This withdrawal of support shook Kinsey, and he never quite regained his confidence. In summary, Alfred Kinsey spent the span between 1938 and 1956 conducting his famous sex surveys. Over these 18 years, he and his staff interviewed over 18,000 men and women and covered topics including masturbation, premarital sex, and homosexual sex. Thanks to the Kinsey Report, the topics of sex and sexuality are no longer restricted to the clergy and psychoanalysts. It has brought the topic into the mainstream, where it can be discussed and addressed by all individuals. He was one of the first researchers to realize the value and importance of studying sex scientifically. He questioned labels like normal and abnormal in the context of sexual matters, and he laid the groundwork for the social changes that occurred in the decades that followed. In a 1948 review published by The Nation, Martin Gumpert sums up the impact of the Kinsey Report as follows. Quote, "We have every reason to be grateful for the book. An immense amount of scientific effort and energy has been invested in it, with the result that the most distorted and maltreated of sciences, the study of sex, has been largely freed from intolerance, superstition, frivolity, and morbidity. Perhaps after reading it, more people will realize that the only practical criterion for judging human sexual behavior is the criterion of potential harmfulness to the community or the individual involved. Man should be entitled to the widest possible variety of sexual outlets as long as they do not harm and lead to satisfaction." Unquote. Gumpert's review, as it turns out, was quite prophetic. In the decades that followed, the work of Kinsey and other sexologists moved sex into the mainstream of American culture and helped to usher in the sexual revolution of the 1960s. One of the reasons that the Kinsey Report has proven so popular is that it helped hundreds of thousands of readers realize that they, in fact, are normal. The topic of sex has always been cloaked in shame and guilt up until this time, and many people suddenly had a huge weight lifted off their shoulders as they realized that their sexual desires and behaviors were not so different from their friends and neighbors. Additionally, Kinsey's work opened the door for public discussion of homosexuality and was one of the first dominoes to fall leading up to the gay rights movement. Alfred Kinsey's life ended in a rather horrifying and tragic fashion. Reeling from the loss of a large portion of his research funding, Kinsey was beset with financial worries. Cracking under the stress of his dwindling financing, he began to engage in more extreme forms of masochism. At one point, he even circumcised himself with a pocket knife without anesthesia. Ugh. Those close to him said he was on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Heart disease flared up during this time, and he finally suffered an embolism and died in 1956. He was 62 years old at the time of his death. He is buried at Rose Hill Cemetery in Bloomington, Indiana. After his death, the Institute moved to a lower profile, and for a time it barely survived. Over the years, Kinsey's successors were able to secure funding in time to rescue it. Alfred Kinsey will always be a problematic fave for me. As someone who sees value in stripping away shame and helping people feel comfortable with their sexuality, I really want to commend Kinsey for his groundbreaking work. However, I still can't get over his blatant failure to turn a sex offender over to the police. There's just no excuse for that. So, in conclusion, if you ever come across a sexual predator while you're doing research, collect your data and then turn them in. Simple as that. Whew, that wraps up our 2-part series on Alfred Kinsey. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check out the Salacious History page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @SalaciousHist. That's SalaciousHist. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing and leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. This really helps other people find the show. This podcast is researched, written, recorded, edited, produced, and marketed all by me. So please, show me some much-needed love and support by partnering with me on patreon.com. If you have questions, corrections, or ideas for future episodes, you can email me at salacioushistory@gmail.com. I'm Sarah Duncan. See you next time.